In 1922, a Dutch retailer opened its first British store on Oxford Street, a few doors from Selfridges. Within decades, it was so woven into British life that shoppers gave it its own nickname, Coats and Hats. By the 1970s, its stores stood on almost every high street in the country. Grandmothers took their daughters there for a first grown-up coat. Mothers bought school uniforms there every September, and brides bought their going-away outfits from its rails. For nearly 80 years, walking into C&A was simply part of being British. Then in June 2000, without warning, the company announced it was closing every single store it had left in Britain. Within 9 months, nearly 5,000 people lost their jobs. The shelves were cleared, and a name that had dressed generations of British families disappeared from the high street for good. How does a company that dressed an entire nation for nearly 80 years vanish almost overnight? While its own name still fills shopping streets across Europe today? This is the story of what happened to C&A in Britain and why nobody saw it coming. Long before the name C&A meant anything to a shopper in London or Liverpool, it belonged to a family of linen traders in the small German town of Mettingen. The Brenninkmeyers had been walking the roads of northern Europe since the 1670s, carrying bolts of cloth from village to village, building a reputation on quality and fair dealing rather than on any fixed shop. It was a trade passed from father to son for generations, patient and unglamorous, built on knowing exactly what ordinary families needed to wear and what they could afford to pay. In 1841, two brothers from that family, Clemens and August Brenninkmeyer, took the next step. Rather than traveling from door to door, they opened a proper shop in the Dutch town of Sneek and named it after their own initials. It was a modest beginning, but the idea behind it was quietly radical. At a time when good clothing was still largely made to measure for those who could afford a tailor, Clemens and August wanted to sell ready-made garments, cut to standard sizes, priced so that a working family could walk in and walk out wearing something new that same day. It was one of the earliest attempts anywhere in Europe to turn fashion from a privilege into something ordinary people could simply buy off a shelf. The idea worked. By 1910, 10 C&A shops were trading across the Netherlands, and the business was already looking beyond its own borders. A store opened in Germany in 1911. Then, in September 1922, the company made its boldest move yet, crossing the North Sea to open its first British shop on Oxford Street in London, a matter of yards from Selfridges, the grandest department store in the country. It was an audacious place to start. Oxford Street was where London went to see the newest and the finest, and into that world walked a Dutch company with no British reputation at all, selling plain, affordable, ready-to-wear clothing rather than luxury. There was no grand opening ceremony to speak of, no press fanfare. What there was instead was a simple, well-lit shop filled with racks of coats, dresses, and hats, at prices far below what London's tailors and department stores were used to charging. For the shop girls, clerks, and tradesmen's wives who could never have afforded a made-to-measure coat, C&A's arrival meant something that Oxford Street had never quite offered before: the chance to dress well without needing to be wealthy. Within a few years, the business added hats to its range, and Londoners coined the affectionate nickname that would follow the company for the rest of its life in Britain: Coats and Hats. A second store opened nearby on the same street in 1925, at first trading discreetly under the name Kanda so as not to appear to compete with its sister shop, until it became clear that London had more than enough demand for both. What the Brenninkmeyer family believed, and what they carried with them from those early Mettingen linen roads all the way to Oxford Street, was simple enough to state plainly: fashion should not belong only to those who could pay a tailor. It should be within reach of anyone who walked through the door. That belief was about to be tested on a much larger stage as C&A prepared to move beyond London and into the industrial cities of the North. By the 1960s, C&A was no longer simply a shop on a handful of high streets. It had become something closer to a national institution, and the 2 decades that followed would mark the height of everything the company had set out to be. The stores themselves had grown into some of the most recognizable buildings in Britain's town centers. Many had been designed in the elegant Art Deco style by the Manchester architectural firm of North, Robin and Wilsden, the same practice responsible for several of Woolworth's finest premises. Their clean lines and confident lettering across the shop front announced to anyone walking past that this was a serious retailer, not a market stall dressed up in a shop window. Some of those buildings would later be listed as protected examples of British commercial architecture, a quiet tribute to just how well they had been built to last. Inside, the experience was changing just as fast as fashion itself. The 1960s and 1970s brought a wave of new man-made fabrics into British wardrobes, and C&A embraced them eagerly. Crimpline and Terlenka became household words, prized for a very practical kind of magic. They did not crease, they washed easily, and they held their shape wash after wash in a way that older, more delicate fabrics simply could not. For a mother raising a family without the luxury of much spare time, a crimpling dress that could go from the washing line straight back onto her back without an iron in sight was not a small convenience. It was close to a miracle. C&A sold that miracle by the rail in bright, modern colors at a price that did not require saving up. Going to C&A became a genuine occasion, threaded through the ordinary rituals of British family life. Every September, mothers took their children in for new school uniforms, working through the racks methodically, sizing up jumpers and blazers a little larger than needed, in the well-founded hope that a growing child would fill them out by Christmas. Brides-to-be came in search of an affordable going-away outfit for after the wedding, something smart enough for the photographs but not so dear that it ate into the budget for the honeymoon. Young women bought their first proper coat there, the one they wore to their first job interview, the one their mother had chosen with them on a Saturday afternoon after months of saving pocket money. None of this happened by accident. C&A had built its reputation precisely on democratizing fashion, on making sure that looking presentable, looking modern, looking like you belonged to the same world as everyone else on the street, did not depend on how much money your family had. In the industrial towns of the North, in the terraced streets of Glasgow and Liverpool and Leeds, that mattered enormously. A woman in Middlesbrough or Hull could walk into her local C&A and buy the same dress, cut from the same fashionable cloth, that was hanging on the rails back on Oxford Street in London. The class divide that had shaped British shopping for so long simply did not apply behind those shop windows. The public affection for the company showed itself in the nickname that had followed it since the 1920s and never really faded. Coats and Ats was said with warmth, not mockery, the sort of nickname reserved for something genuinely loved, rather than merely tolerated. Fashion magazines took note of that affection too. Bella, one of the best-selling women's weeklies of the era, regularly featured C&A garments across its pages throughout the 1970s and 1980s, treating the chain as a serious source of style rather than a budget afterthought. For the ordinary reader flicking through those pages on a bus home from work, seeing C&A included alongside more expensive names was itself a quiet form of validation. Behind the counters, the experience was its own kind of institution. For thousands of shop assistants across Britain, a job at C&A was often a first job, sometimes a lifelong one, passed down in families much as the shopping habit itself was passed down from mother to daughter. Staff came to know their regular customers by name, knew which aunt was buying for which niece's wedding, knew who would be back in for the January sale the moment the new stock went up. It was retail conducted at a human scale, even inside a company that by then operated well over 100 stores across the country. What was it exactly that made a Saturday trip to C&A feel less like a chore and more like a small event worth dressing for? Perhaps it was simply this. For 2 generations of British families, C&A was the place where affording something new never felt like settling for less. But fashion, by its very nature, does not stand still. And the tastes that C&A had served so faithfully through the 1960s and 1970s were about to shift faster than anyone inside the company could yet imagine. The stores that had once felt so modern, so in step with the times, were quietly approaching a decade in which being in step would no longer be enough. The success of Oxford Street was never going to stay confined to London. Almost as soon as C&A had proven that British shoppers wanted what it was selling, the company began the steady work of taking that offer to every corner of the country. And the pace and shape of that expansion would end up defining the business for the rest of the century. The first move beyond the capital came in 1924, when C&A opened a store in Liverpool. Fittingly enough, inside a wing of the city's new Woolworths development, another retailer built on the same promise of affordable goods for ordinary people. 5 years later, a further outlet opened in Leeds, and through the following decades, the company kept pushing outward into Manchester, Glasgow, Hull, Birmingham, and the industrial towns that had grown wealthy, if not always comfortable, on manufacturing and shipping. By the time a store opened on Linthorpe Road in Middlesbrough, C&A had become a familiar name from the Thames to the Clyde. This was not expansion for its own sake. Each new store followed a deliberate strategy. Go where the working population was largest and place the shop as close as possible to the beating commercial heart of the town on the same high street as the market, the bank, and the parish church. C&A did not chase the countryside or the coast. It chased footfall, wages, and the daily rhythm of people who worked hard during the week and shopped hard on a Saturday. Unlike so many American retail giants built through franchising, where local owners bought into a brand and ran it their own way, C&A's expansion machine worked entirely differently. Every single store remained wholly owned and controlled by the Brenninkmeier family through its private holding structure. There were no franchisees to negotiate with, no local operators cutting corners or defending their own patch. Head office decided the range, the pricing, the shop fitting, right down to the mannequins in the window, and every branch, whether in London or Leeds, delivered exactly the same experience. It was consistency by design, achieved not through contracts but through ownership. That consistency extended to the buildings themselves. As the network grew through the 1920s and 1930s, C&A commissioned some of its finest premises from the Manchester firm of North, Robin and Willesden, architects who had already made their name designing striking Art Deco stores for Woolworths. Their C&A buildings shared that same confident, modern language. Clean stone facades, bold lettering, generous windows built to show off the merchandise to a passing crowd. These were not shops thrown up cheaply to catch a trend. They were built as permanent statements on the high street, several of which would later be recognized by historic England as buildings worth protecting for their architectural merit. For the towns themselves, a new C&A store was rarely a small event. It brought jobs, often several dozen at a stroke, at a time when steady retail employment was genuinely valued. It brought footfall that benefited neighboring shops, and it brought a certain civic pride, the sense that a town had arrived, that it now belonged among the ranks of British cities important enough to deserve one of Coates and Att's handsome new stores. For a young woman in Middlesbrough or Hull, a job behind the counter at C&A was not a poor substitute for factory or dock work. It was often considered a step up, a cleaner, more respectable trade with a uniform, a discount on new clothes, and a customer base drawn largely from her own community. Yet expansion of this kind was never entirely without friction. As the network grew from a handful of flagship stores into more than 100 branches spread across the length of the country, maintaining the same standard everywhere became a genuinely difficult exercise. Head office in the Netherlands and Germany set the design and the buying decisions centrally, which guaranteed consistency, but it also meant that a store in Glasgow was stocked with much the same range, cut to much the same continental taste, as a store in Amsterdam or Dusseldorf. For now, in the middle decades of the century, British shoppers were more than happy with what continental fashion sense had to offer. That happy alignment between what C&A made and what Britain wanted to wear was, for the moment, the foundation of everything the company had built. It would not stay that way forever. By the 1970s, the expansion machine had done its work. C&A's rainbow-striped logo hung over high streets from Aberdeen to Southampton, and the company stood, by any measure, among the great retail success stories of post-war Britain. The stage was set for the height of its powers, a period when C&A would move from being merely a popular shop to something closer to a fixture of national life. By the late 1970s, C&A had passed a point that few foreign retailers ever reach. It was no longer a Dutch company that happened to trade in Britain. It had become, in the eyes of the average British shopper, simply British. A fixture of the high street as familiar and unremarkable as the post office or the bank. Present in some form in nearly every town of any size across the country. At its height, the company operated 113 stores across the United Kingdom, a network so complete that for millions of families, there was simply no need to shop anywhere else for everyday, affordable clothing. This was the period when C&A stopped being merely a shop people used and became a shop people belonged to. It is difficult to overstate how deeply that sense of belonging ran through ordinary British households. A woman who had bought her own first coat there as a teenager in the 1950s might, 20 years later, be taking her own daughter through exactly the same doors, past exactly the same rainbow-striped signage, to buy a first coat of her own. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters shopping under one roof across 3 generations was not an unusual sight in a C&A store on a Saturday afternoon. Few businesses managed to embed themselves that deeply into the private rhythms of family life, and fewer still managed to do it while remaining, at their core, a foreign company selling continental fashion to a British audience. The wider culture noticed too. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Bella magazine, one of the biggest-selling women's weeklies in the country, featured C&A's ranges on its pages as a matter of routine, placing the chain's clothing alongside far pricier names without any sense of embarrassment. For the millions of women who read Bella on their lunch break or on the bus home, seeing C&A treated as a legitimate source of style, rather than simply the budget option, was a quiet but powerful endorsement. It told an entire generation that looking fashionable and being sensible with money were not opposites. C&A had made that idea feel completely normal. The company's confidence during these years extended well beyond Britain's borders, and that wider international standing only reinforced the sense, at home, that this was no ordinary high street chain. C&A's name had appeared among the sponsors of the 1974 World Cup, and later in the decade, the company put its name behind professional cycling, backing Eddie Merckx's team as it dominated European racing. For a British shopper, these were the kind of associations usually reserved for national institutions, not for a shop on the corner of the local high street. It lent the brand a certain unspoken prestige, even as its prices stayed resolutely within reach of an ordinary wage. Inside the stores themselves, working for C&A during these years carried a quiet pride of its own. Staff turnover on the shop floor was often low, and it was common for an assistant to spend not just years, but an entire working life with the company, moving up from the till to supervising a department, sometimes to managing a branch. Head office in the Netherlands set the standards centrally, but the day-to-day character of each store, the relationships built with regular customers, the small kindnesses of putting something aside under the counter for a loyal shopper who had mentioned she liked it, were entirely local. For many towns, particularly the smaller industrial ones where large employers were becoming harder to find, a stable job at C&A was genuinely valued, offering steady hours, a uniform allowance, and a staff discount that made the shop feel a little like an extension of home. Geographically, C&A had achieved something that very few British retailers of any era could claim. It offered exactly the same range, the same prices, and the same shopping experience, whether a customer walked into the flagship on Oxford Street or into the branch on Linthorpe Road in Middlesbrough. In a country still sharply divided by region and by class, C&A's stores were, in their own understated way, a genuinely unifying national experience. The dress on the rail in London was the same dress on the rail in Glasgow, at the same price, cut from the same continental cloth. It would be tempting to rush past this moment and move straight to what came next, but that would do the story a disservice. This was the high point, the years when C&A was not merely surviving on the British high street, but defining part of it, trusted by 3 generations under one roof, and celebrated in the same magazines that celebrated far grander names. What made the years that followed so difficult to watch was precisely how complete this success had been. Nobody standing in a C&A store in 1978, admiring the new season's crimpling dresses, could have imagined that within 25 years the company would abandon the country entirely. The high street was about to change faster than anyone inside C&A's boardroom yet understood, and the very things that had made the company so successful for so long were about to become the seeds of its undoing. Nobody standing in a C&A store in the early 1980s would have believed that anything could be wrong. The tills were busy, the stores were full on a Saturday, and the rainbow logo above every high street still meant exactly what it had always meant: reliable, affordable, familiar clothing for anyone who walked through the door. And yet quietly, almost invisibly at first, the ground beneath the company had already begun to shift. The change did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived the way most retail decline arrives, as a slow accumulation of smaller shops opening on the same high streets, each one chipping away a little more custom than the last. Through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, a new generation of British retailers began to take shape, and they understood something that C&A, for all its decades of experience, had started to miss. Matalan built its business on out-of-town discount pricing that undercut C&A on value alone. New Look and Next moved faster on fashion, refreshing their ranges in weeks rather than seasons. Marks and Spencer, always a quiet rival, kept expanding its own clothing lines with a confidence that suggested it had no intention of sharing the middle ground. And a small Irish chain called Primark, still modest in size at this stage, was beginning to prove that rock-bottom prices and fast-changing stock could pull in exactly the younger shoppers that C&A had once claimed as its own. The deeper problem sat closer to home, inside C&A's own head office. The company's buying and design decisions were still made centrally, largely shaped by continental European taste, the same approach that had served the business so well when British fashion had followed a similar rhythm to fashion in Germany and the Netherlands. By the 1990s, that alignment had quietly broken down. British style was moving in its own direction, faster and more restless than the continental sensibility that still governed what appeared on C&A's rails. Clothes that would sell confidently in Amsterdam or Dusseldorf began to look, to British eyes, a step behind. It was never a dramatic failure of design so much as a persistent, low-grade mismatch, the kind that a shopper might not even be able to name, but would feel every time she walked the aisles and found nothing that quite matched what she had seen on television or in a magazine that week. By 1995, that mismatch had become a number on a balance sheet. C&A's British operation was losing money, a fact that would have shocked a shopper in Middlesbrough or Hull in the 1970s, but had become, by the mid-1990s, an open secret within the industry. The company was not blind to the problem. In 1998, C&A announced a substantial $200 million investment program aimed at modernizing its stores and closing its weakest performers, a serious and expensive attempt to prove that the brand could still compete on Britain's changing high street. New shop fitting went in. Underperforming branches were quietly shut. For a moment, it looked as though C&A intended to fight for its place. The trouble was that money spent on shop fronts could not, on its own, solve a problem rooted much deeper in what was actually hanging on the rails inside. Jackie High, editor of Bella magazine, the very publication that had featured C&A's fashions so warmly through the 1970s and 1980s, put the shift plainly when she later reflected on the decade that had just passed. The company had drifted, in her words, towards stocking safe clothes. It was a quiet but damning verdict from someone who had spent years championing the brand. A retailer that had once made its name by democratizing fashion, by putting the latest style within reach of ordinary families, was now being described by its own longtime supporters as merely dependable, no longer exciting, no longer quite worth the special trip. Somewhere in a C&A store in the mid-1990s, a loyal shop assistant who had worked behind the same counter for 20 years might have noticed the change before anyone in the boardroom admitted it out loud. Fewer young mothers browsing with their teenage daughters. Fewer requests for the newest line. More customers who came only out of habit, buying school uniforms or work basics rather than anything they were excited to wear. She would have seen the $200 million refurbishment arrive, the new lighting and the new fittings, and she would have kept folding the same slightly dated dresses onto the same newly painted shelves, wondering perhaps whether new paint could really solve what was wrong. How long could a company this trusted, this deeply woven into British family life, actually keep losing money before something had to give? Nobody shopping there in 1996 was asking that question. They were simply doing what they had always done, buying school jumpers in September and a new coat before Christmas. entirely unaware that the shop they trusted without a second thought was already fighting quietly for its survival. What made these early cracks so dangerous was precisely how little most customers noticed them. The stores still looked much the same. The staff were still the familiar faces behind the till. But beneath that reassuring surface, a company that had once shaped what British fashion looked like was steadily losing its grip on the one thing that had always kept it alive. The certainty in every shopper's mind that C&A knew exactly what they wanted to wear. To understand why C&A's British operation eventually failed so completely, it helps to understand a quality that had always set the company apart and which had quietly become one of its greatest weaknesses. The Brenninkmeier family had run C&A since 1841 as a private, tightly controlled enterprise, and they had guarded that privacy fiercely for a century and a half. The company published almost nothing about its internal finances. It rarely spoke to the press. Even by the standards of family-owned businesses, C&A operated behind a wall of silence so complete that journalists covering the retail sector routinely described it as one of the most secretive large companies in Europe. For most of its history, that secrecy had cost the business very little. A private company answerable only to its own family did not need to satisfy shareholders demanding quarterly growth and could make long, patient decisions rather than short-term ones. It was in many ways exactly the kind of ownership structure that should have allowed C&A to weather difficult years calmly, without panic. But secrecy and tight family control cut two ways. Decisions about what British shoppers should be offered were still being made largely from the Netherlands and Germany, filtered through a family leadership that had built its fortune on a European continental sense of style, and which had little obligation to open itself up to outside expertise. There was no outside board pushing hard questions about why the British business was underperforming its European counterparts. There was no requirement to publish detailed figures that might have forced an earlier reckoning. The family did not need to explain itself to anyone but itself, and for a business quietly losing ground on a fast-changing high street, that insulation from scrutiny was, in hindsight, close to fatal. The company only began adding its first non-family members to its board and publishing financial information at all in the late 1990s, a full generation after British shopping habits had already begun to shift away from what C&A was offering. The fatal decision, if it can be called a single decision at all, was really an accumulation of smaller ones repeated year after year. The choice, again and again, to trust that a continental design sensibility that had worked for 150 years would go on working in Britain indefinitely, rather than building a genuinely British buying operation that answered to British tastes on British timescales. It was not recklessness. It was something quieter and, in its way, more forgivable. A deep, understandable confidence built on a century of success, which slowly hardened into an inability to hear what its own British customers were trying to tell it. For the people working inside C&A's British stores during these years, the effects of that slow drift were felt long before head office acted on them. Staff who had spent decades on the shop floor, who prided themselves on knowing their regular customers by name, began to notice something they could not fix from behind a till. Fewer of the younger shoppers who had once filled the stores on a Saturday afternoon, and more customers who came only out of habit rather than excitement. A till operator in a northern branch could see, week after week, which rails were untouched by closing time and which racks at Primark or New Look down the street were being picked clean. That knowledge rarely traveled upward. There was no clear channel between a shop assistant in Middlesbrough and a boardroom in the Netherlands. And even if there had been, a company that had never needed to listen closely to outside voices was not well practiced at listening now. By the late 1990s, the figures had become impossible to explain away with confidence alone. The British business had lost some $250 million over 5 years, a scale of loss that even a wealthy, patient family firm could not absorb indefinitely. The $200 million investment program launched in 1998, meant to modernize stores and cut away the weakest performers, was in many respects an honest and serious attempt to address the crisis. But it treated the symptom rather than the cause. New shop fitting and brighter lighting could not on their own close the gap between what continental buyers thought British women wanted to wear and what British women were actually choosing to buy elsewhere. Even as the refurbishment rolled out, the deeper mismatch in taste and pace remained unresolved, because fixing it would have meant surrendering exactly the kind of centralized, family-controlled decision-making that had defined C&A since 1841. There is no single documented boardroom moment, no whistleblower memo, that marks the instant C&A's leadership finally accepted the British business could not be saved. What the record does show is a company that kept trying reasonable, moderate remedies, refurbishment, selective closures, right up until 1999 and early 2000, while the losses continued regardless. Somewhere in that period, quietly and without public announcement, the calculation inside the family's private headquarters must have shifted from how do we fix Britain to how do we leave it. By the time that answer arrived, it did not come as a gradual wind down that staff could see coming and prepare for. It came, as the world would learn a few months later, as a single sudden decision made behind closed doors in the country where the company had always kept its secrets, about a British business built by generations of ordinary shop staff who would be the very last to know. The announcement came on a Thursday in mid-June 2000, and it came with no warning at all. Across Britain, at store after store, staff arrived for their normal morning shift to find something had changed before the doors had even opened. In Middlesbrough, the 30 staff who worked the local C&A branch turned up as they always did, only to find the shutters staying down well past opening time. Something was clearly wrong, and the uncertainty in that gap, standing outside a locked shop they had worked in for years, not knowing why, was itself a small foretaste of what was coming. When the doors finally opened and management gathered the staff to deliver the news, the words were simple and final. Every one of C&A's 113 stores across the United Kingdom, along with its stores in Dublin and Belfast, was going to close. Nearly 4,800 jobs held by people who had built entire careers behind those counters would disappear within 9 months. The scale of it stunned an industry that thought it already understood C&A's troubles. This was not a handful of poor-performing branches being quietly trimmed, the kind of rationalization the company had carried out in 1998. This was total withdrawal, a decision to abandon an entire national market outright, all at once, rather than fight on store by store. Reuters described it to the world within hours as a shock to the British high street, and the description was not an exaggeration. Retail analysts and rival chains alike had assumed, right up until that Thursday, that C&A was struggling but stable, the kind of company that trimmed its sails in difficult years and carried on. Instead, the family that had guarded its decisions in private for 160 years had decided entirely out of public view to leave Britain altogether, and told the country only once the decision could no longer be reversed. The speed of what followed was its own kind of shock. 9 months is no time at all to unwind a business built over nearly 80 years, and yet that was the timetable handed down from head office. Store by store, department by department. The clearance began almost immediately. Stock that would once have been refreshed with the new season's lines instead began working its way toward the door through markdown after markdown, the racks thinning a little more each week as regular customers, many of whom had shopped there for decades without a second thought, started to realize that this was not a normal January sale. For staff, the 9-month countdown meant something harder still. Showing up to serve customers, folding stock, running the till, all while knowing with absolute certainty that the job would not exist by the following spring. There was no ambiguity to hide behind, no hope that trading might improve enough to change the outcome. The end date was already fixed. The press coverage that followed captured a genuine sense of public mourning, tinged with a certain wry, very British affection for a shop that had never quite shaken off its old nickname. The Independent ran its account under a headline that played on that same nickname the company had carried since the 1920s, describing C&A's fall from coats and ats to closure and acrimony, a joke with a real note of sadness underneath it. The Irish Times reported soberly on the 4,800 jobs at stake across Britain and Ireland, treating the closure as the serious economic story it was for the towns that depended on those stores. What came through in nearly every report was the same unresolved question that had been quietly building for years, now suddenly impossible to ignore. How had a company so thoroughly woven into ordinary British life been allowed to reach this point without anyone outside its boardroom seeing it coming? For the shoppers who had grown up with C&A, the news landed with a particular kind of disbelief. This was not some newer, untested chain closing after a few difficult years. This was the shop where their mothers had bought their school uniforms, where they themselves had bought their first proper coat, where three generations of the same family had sometimes shopped together on the same Saturday afternoon. To learn that it was disappearing entirely, not shrinking but vanishing completely from the country, felt less like ordinary business news and more like losing a fixture of the landscape that people had simply assumed would always be there. Through the second half of 2000 and into the first weeks of 2001, the closures rolled steadily across the country, town by town, in an order that followed no pattern a regular shopper could have predicted. One month it was a branch in the Northeast, the next a store in the Midlands, then London itself, the very street where the whole British story had begun in 1922. Each closure followed its own smaller version of the same sad arithmetic, a final clearance sale, deeper and deeper discounts as the deadline approached, shelves and rails growing visibly bare by the week, until a store that had once stocked the latest season's fashion was reduced to a handful of odd sizes and unwanted colors scattered across half-empty fixtures. Regular customers who had shopped there for years found themselves making one last visit, sometimes without quite planning to, drawn back by nostalgia or simple habit, only to find the shop they remembered stripped down to something that barely resembled it. For staff, the experience of working through a slow-motion closure was its own particular kind of hardship. Long-serving employees, some who had spent 20 or 30 years with the company, worked their final shifts knowing exactly how many were left, watching colleagues they had known for decades leave one by one as different departments wound down ahead of others. There was little of the sudden drama that marks a company collapsing into bankruptcy overnight. Instead, there was a slow, deliberate dismantling, carried out in full view of the staff and customers who had built their lives, however modestly, around the rhythm of that shop. The last C&A stores in Britain finally closed their doors in January 2001, bringing to an end just under 80 years of trading that had begun on Oxford Street in 1922. The Guardian marked the moment with an obituary of sorts, reporting soberly that the threadbare company had closed its last British stores, a quiet, almost muted headline for the end of a business that had once dressed a nation. There was no single dramatic final day to point to, no crowd of loyal customers gathering outside a flagship store for one last look. In the way some retail closures are remembered, the end came, fittingly perhaps for a company that had always guarded its business quietly, in a series of small, scattered closures across dozens of towns, each one significant to the people who worked there and shopped there, and largely unremarked upon everywhere else. What happened to the buildings themselves told its own story about who had actually won. Across the country, the very companies whose rise had helped drive C&A out of Britain moved quickly to claim the empty premises for themselves. At least 11 former C&A stores were taken over and reopened as branches of Primark, the fast-growing discount chain whose low prices and rapid fashion turnover had done more than almost any single competitor to make C&A's continental, slower-moving ranges look expensive and out of step. Other former C&A buildings, many of them the same handsome Art Deco premises built with such confidence back in the 1920s and 1930s, were taken over by different retailers or repurposed entirely, their rainbow-striped signage stripped away and replaced within months. By the time the last shutters came down in January 2001, C&A had lost not just its stores, but something harder to measure: its place as a fixture of British life, the shop that three generations of the same family could once walk into together without a second thought. The company itself was not finished. Its European and Latin American businesses carried on, and within a year the family was already speaking publicly about new investment in markets far from Britain. But for the towns whose high streets had featured a C&A store for the better part of a century, and for the thousands of staff who had spent their working lives behind its counters, what closed in January 2001 was not simply a chain of shops. It was the end of an era that an entire generation had assumed, right up until that Thursday in June 2000, would simply go on. Once the last shutters came down in January 2001, the question facing every town that had lost its C&A was a simple, practical one. Who would take its place? The answer arrived quickly, and it was rarely kind to the memory of what had gone before. Primark, the very chain whose low prices and constantly refreshed stock had done so much to make C&A's continental ranges look slow and expensive by comparison, moved into at least 11 of the vacated stores, often within months of the closure sales ending. Metallan and New Look picked up custom in towns where no direct replacement store opened at all, absorbing the shoppers who had once walked past their doors on the way to C&A out of pure habit. Within a remarkably short space of time, the gap C&A left behind had been filled almost seamlessly by the same competitors whose rise had made that gap inevitable in the first place. What makes the C&A story unusual, set against so many of the great retail collapses of the 20th century, is that this was never truly a story of a company dying. Barely a year after walking away from Britain, C&A's leadership was speaking openly about fresh investment elsewhere, and the direction of that investment told its own story about where the family believed the future lay. Two stores had already opened in Mexico by 1999, with plans for as many as 30 more within a decade. A first store had opened in the Czech Republic that same year, part of a wider push into the newly opening markets of Eastern Europe. Argentina had welcomed its first C&A store in 1996, backed by a pledge of some $2,000 million in investment. While the lights went out on Oxford Street, C&A was quietly building an entirely new chapter of its history in markets that had never known the brand at all and had no fixed expectations of continental European fashion to disappoint. That is, in the end, the real lesson the British retreat offers the wider industry. Failure in one market does not necessarily mean failure of the underlying business. C&A's fortune, built patiently since 1841 and still controlled entirely by the Brenninkmeier family, remained one of the largest privately held retail fortunes in the world, even as the British operation folded. The company had not misjudged fashion itself, nor lost its instinct for affordable, ready-to-wear clothing. It had simply misjudged one particular country for one particular stretch of years by continuing to dress British shoppers in continental taste long after British taste had gone its own way. Other European retailers watching from the sidelines took note. A brand that succeeds everywhere else cannot assume success anywhere by default. Every market, however familiar it appears, has to be won on its own terms again and again. For the towns left behind, the economic impact ran deeper than the simple loss of a shop. In Middlesbrough, in Hull, in dozens of similar high streets, the closure removed not just 4,800 jobs at a stroke, but a certain kind of employer that many of those towns were finding harder and harder to attract. A stable, respectable retail position that had once been treated almost as a job for life. Former staff scattered into whatever retail and service work the local economy could still offer. Some, particularly those who had worked their way into store management, found positions with the very rivals that had helped drive C&A out, taking their decades of experience with till systems, stock, and customer relationships into new uniforms bearing different names. Others, especially older staff who had spent 30 years or more behind a single counter, found the transition far harder, entering a job market in the early 2000s that had little patience for a CV built around a single, now vanished employer. The buildings themselves became a quiet, physical record of who had inherited Britain's high street, where a C&A store had once stood with its confident Art Deco frontage, a Primark sign now often hung in its place, or a New Look, or in some towns a strip of smaller, cheaper units carved out of the same large floor space that had once housed a single unified shop. The handsome premises designed decades earlier by North, Robin, and Willesden, several of them later protected for their architectural merit, survived the closure even where the business inside them had not. In an odd way, the buildings outlasted the company that built its reputation inside them, standing today as C&A's most visible legacy on British streets, even though the name above the door has long since changed. No revival was ever seriously attempted. There was no relaunch, No nostalgic pop-up, no attempt to sell the C&A name back into a British market that had, by the mid-2000s, moved on entirely. The recipes of continental ready-to-wear fashion that had once dressed generations of British families were never brought back, quietly retired along with the company's British division itself. What remained instead was the memory, carried by the generation who had shopped there, and a question worth asking as new high streets continue to change hands from one retailer to the next. What do towns actually lose, beyond a shop, when a business that once felt permanent simply decides one quiet Thursday that it is time to leave? Somewhere in Britain tonight, a woman in her 70s is describing a crimpline dress to her granddaughter, the one she bought from C&A for a wedding sometime in the mid-1970s, the one that never needed ironing and never lost its color no matter how many times it went through the wash. She remembers walking into the Oxford Street store as a young woman, or perhaps a smaller branch on her own local high street, past racks organized by size and color, past the smell of new fabric and the particular hush of a well-run shop on a Saturday afternoon. She remembers her own mother standing beside her, choosing a coat together, the two of them agreeing on the collar, disagreeing gently on the shade. The granddaughter listening will never feel that crimpline between her fingers, never smell that shop, never know the particular relief of finding something fashionable that her family could actually afford without a second thought. But in the telling, something of it survives anyway. What C&A offered across nearly 80 years on British high streets was never really about the clothes themselves. It was about the quiet dignity of being able to dress well without needing to be wealthy, a promise the Brenninkmeier family had carried with them since their earliest days as traveling linen merchants in the 17th century, long before any shop bore their initials. In towns built on shipbuilding, steel, and textiles, where wages were earned carefully and spent even more carefully, C&A meant that a mother did not have to choose between a warm winter coat and the rest of the week's shopping. It meant a bride could walk away from her own wedding in something new and well-made, without the cost overshadowing the day itself. It meant 3 generations of the same family could stand in the same shop, choosing from the same rails, feeling that fashion belonged to them just as much as it belonged to anyone shopping on Bond Street. That was never a small thing to offer a country, and it was never adequately replaced when the doors finally closed. The discount chains that took over C&A's old premises may have matched its prices, but none of them carried quite the same 80 years of quiet trust that a mother had once placed in this particular name, on this particular high street, for this particular family occasion. C&A's disappearance from Britain was never really about clothes going out of fashion. It was about a company that had once understood exactly what ordinary families needed, slowly losing the thread of that understanding, one season at a time, until the gap between what it offered and what Britain wanted to wear became too wide to close. There is no villain to name here, no single reckless decision to point to with anger. There is only the quiet, familiar tragedy of an institution outliving its own relevance, of a family that had built something remarkable choosing, in the end, to walk away rather than watch it fade further. The staff who spent their working lives behind those counters deserve to be remembered, not for how the story ended, but for the decades of steady, decent work that came before it. Fitting coats, folding jumpers, remembering which customer liked which color. The founders, 2 brothers from Mettingen, who believed that fashion should not belong only to the wealthy, built something that genuinely changed how ordinary people dressed for the better part of 2 centuries. And the customers, the mothers and daughters and grandmothers who filled those stores every September and every December deserve to know that the affection they felt for that rainbow sign above the door was never misplaced. The high street changes hands constantly, one name giving way to another as fashions and fortunes shift. But not every departure leaves quite the same quiet absence that C&A's did, nor quite the same lesson worth keeping, that even the most trusted names must keep listening to the people they serve, and that some kinds of loyalty, once lost, do not come back no matter how much money is spent trying to win them back.